Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be looking at the effects of World War One, specifically the internal migration that is often called the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South. And then we're going to also look at the limits on immigration. So, all that external immigration that's been coming into the United States, that is going to very quickly dry up following World War One. And we're going to be looking toward the reasons for that as well. So let us start with the Great Migration. And this phrase may sound familiar to you. It should, because we use that phrase to describe the large movement of Puritan peoples from England to the New World between about 1630 and 1640. And we're using that phrase again, but this time to speak about African Americans. From 1915 to about 1930, we see a large movement of people, probably close to 400,000, 500,000 people moving out of the former 11 states of the Confederacy and coming northward and filling up the cities of the United States in both the East and the West. We're also going to see that take form again in another migratory movement of African Americans, starting with World War II through 1970. But today we're going to focus on the effects of World War One, so this first Great Migration. You'll see throughout the presentation artwork in the style that is on the screen. This was painted by Jacob Lawrence, who's an African American artist, part of that Harlem Renaissance movement. He painted lots of pictures of American history, but he wanted to, in his own time, to catalog the experience of African Americans as they moved to the North. And you will see quite a few of those dispersed throughout our presentation today. So the causes, well, ultimately, World War One is a cause of this Great Migration. And why? Well, think about all the labor that had been coming into the United States in 1890, 1900, 1910. 3 million of people a year coming through just Ellis Island alone. Um, Lots of unskilled jobs to be filled. But in 1914, when World War One breaks out in Europe, all of a sudden those countries are at war. They're conscripting their people to fight. They're gearing themselves towards this total war effort. And so that's going to dry up much of the immigration. But for people who could leave, even if you had the money, um, you were going to go across the Atlantic at a time when you had submarines taking out ships. I mean, it would have been a dangerous journey. And so you had essentially no immigration, and certainly not in the numbers that you had been seeing for the last 25 years. So, what do these factories do? They have a labor shortage. And for the first time, you're going to see that companies are willing to hire African Americans en masse to come and work. And not only are they willing to pay certainly better wages than they would have been receiving working in the South, but they even paid housing advances. They directly advertised in African American newspapers across the country in order to bring that labor force northward. So why go north? Every time we talk about migration, we look at push factors and pull factors. And the push factors, obviously, the contextualization that leads us up to this period is Jim Crow. The fact that lynching was happening in the South at a rate of about a lynching every 4 days, significant restrictions on people's lives, lack of economic mobility, in particular things like sharecropping, and with sharecropping, the price of cotton was struggling. It was an area where you saw, like many other agricultural products, overproduction and less value over time. So people have reasons to leave the South. Then we look at the pull factors. Well, certainly jobs that were pretty well paying. And the pull factor for the jobs really is between 1915 and 1918. It's while World War One is raging. Europe needs American materials. The factories are making armaments and actually helping those belligerents, selling products to them long before they were being utilized to produce goods for the US war effort. And then once you had people established, you're beginning to build Black communities. Places like Chicago, Harlem, New York City, Detroit, Milwaukee, these places had African American populations certainly before this large migration, but they were relatively small. And once people begin to establish themselves, we saw this with the ethnic enclaves that developed as a part of urbanization and immigration. You're going to see the same thing happening as well for African Americans. That is not to say that segregation didn't exist. And I think this is a great picture because it puts us in the time period of World War One. These seamstresses are sewing tents, but if you notice, these African American workers are separated by a glass partition, and on the other side are the white workers employed by the factory. So even in the North, and this is in New York City, you could see that segregation was still alive and well. But other aspects of life were certainly improvements compared to what people had experienced in the South. Also, when we look at migratory patterns in human history, we often look at shipping routes. We look at essentially the path that people could walk. We're now going to be looking at rail lines. That's what's going to really define where African Americans settle in this period. And it's the rail lines based on the state you come from. So if you were from Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, you either were going westward to places like Los Angeles or the San Francisco, Oakland area, or you were going directly north to a place like Minneapolis. If you were from the central South, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, you were more likely to be going to Detroit, to Chicago, maybe somewhere like Milwaukee. The eastern lines, so people coming out of Georgia, the Carolinas, they're going to be headed towards cities like New York City, Buffalo, Boston, but that is going to be their trajectory. You literally got to the train station and you were going based on where those rail lines went. And so that shows us some very interesting patterns as well. And again, as I said, there are really two waves to this movement. Today, we're just focusing on the first wave as an effect of World War One. By 1939, you had about a half a million African Americans who'd moved out of the South. Why is that significant? Well, in 1910, according to the census, 90% of African Americans in the United States lived in the South. By 1970, only 50% of African Americans live in the South. So, over the course of 55, 60 years, you are going to see a significant movement of people who are really going to create a new life for themselves in ways that they couldn't where they had lived before. So when we talk about the effects, we have a lot of effects. I mean, as I spoke before, we have Black enclaves that are going to develop in these cities in the North. And certainly that's going to create a network of people who can help bring new people to these enclaves, and certainly advocacy. If you're an African American in 1915, sure, where you live, you could buy the general newspaper. Even in the North, something like the Chicago Tribune is not going to have many stories about African Americans. And when they do, they're typically going to be negative stories about criminality. If they're positive, maybe about athletics. So, how do you see news that's about your locality, about your people? Well, there were lots of African American newspapers, and they certainly were full of advertisements that also encouraged this movement north. But also the NAACP, what will become the United Negro Improvement Association, that Black nationalist organization, these groups are going to be able to thrive and grow because of this movement of people. Access to public schooling, even if segregated, far superior, certainly a much longer period of time. In the rural South, most African Americans were lucky if their county offered a single African American school. If it did, it was typically a one-room schoolhouse. And that would have been for multiple grades. And typically there was no public instruction above about age 12 or 13, what would be sixth or seventh grade today. So there was ultimately high school and there was a path forward educationally in the North that just wasn't available in the South. Cultural diffusion. Jazz music, right, is one of many forms of American music. And it certainly has Afro roots. It's going to be something that people certainly were playing 20 years before in areas like New Orleans, but you're going to see that music travel north, and it's ultimately going to be the music of the 1920s. It is going to not only in itself be music, but it's also going to influence the popular music of the day, and certainly be create an exposure to white audiences that had not experienced that before. Greater voter participation, no literacy test to register to vote, no poll tax. And so you're going to see African Americans, certainly by the late 1930s, early 1940s, are going to become more and more of a voting bloc that both parties are going to be looking towards in terms of sealing those elections in their favor. And then obviously we've talked about population movement, and there's going to be some negative effects for African Americans who moved north, who took jobs during World War One. Not only were they fulfilling a shortage in labor that had once been filled by immigrants, but in general, white males 18 to 35 found themselves either volunteering or being conscripted into the U.S. Army. Those positions were filled not only by African Americans and also by women, but when these white males returned, the expectation they had was that their job would be there for them and that these other people would just relinquish their work. Unions also did not strike during World War One, but after World War One did, and often became African Americans found themselves being utilized as strikebreakers. So you had a lot of animosity being fomented between black and white peoples in these cities following World War One. But our African American enclaves. So in a city like Chicago, the picture that you see in the lower left-hand corner here, it was a picture that you would probably not be able to take in 1890 because there was not a significant enough population. But you're going to begin to see entire communities that are full of tens of thousands of people develop in these cities like Chicago and New York. And in New York specifically, you're going to see an artistic movement take off. I find most students have some familiarity with the poetry of Langston Hughes. It's quite accessible in terms of composers and performers. I find a lot of people have heard the work of Louis Armstrong, but lots of other peoples who would not have been able to express themselves artistically from where they came from in the South are going to be able to do that in the North. In particular, our writers and our artists are often painting images where the protagonists are African American and or there is a critique of the larger white culture, both of which were just they were suppressed in the South. And again, when we speak about popular music, we're also entering the era of radio, records. And so many of these artists, when they come to a large city, the largest city in the United States, which is New York, there's just the opportunity to be exposed to a much, much larger American audience. We're also going to see another movement towards equality and autonomy by African Americans in what will become the rise of Black nationalism. And today I'm only going to speak about Marcus Garvey because essentially he is the intellectual father of Black nationalism. That is not to be confused with the work of people like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. Both of those men were looking to facilitate greater equality in different ways for African Americans relative to the white population, believing that the Constitution itself was the path forward. For Washington, he felt that it was going to take time and economic improvement in order to bring about the social and the political. W.B. Du Bois wanted to focus on challenging laws bit by bit to basically chip away what had been the historical interpretations of the Constitution, in particular with things like the 14th and 15th Amendments. Black nationalism is, in a sense, giving up on that promise and looking either to have a Black nation for Black people within the larger white nation, or perhaps going somewhere else. That Back to Africa movement was something that Marcus Garvey advocated for. He was Jamaican born, came to the United States in his early 20s. Um, and believed that there were things that already pre-existed with the African American community, especially because of segregation. You had cities like Durham, North Carolina, where you had a pretty large working and middle class Black population, doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, but serving one another. Because of segregation, for the most part, African Americans certainly couldn't eat in white owned restaurants, stay in white owned hotels. They often had different entrances for things like department stores. And so African American communities had created these economic relationships to best serve themselves. He wanted to build upon that and said, let's look towards what has been the successful capitalist structure for whites in this second industrial revolution, and that's the corporation. He'll start several. He will also produce what was known as the Negro World, which was a national newspaper, the Black Star Line, which was a company that ultimately would provide transportation, Atlantic transportation, in steamships. Where he ran afoul of the United States government was often in his speech. He spoke outwardly about issues like lynching, whereas Du Bois had his not so subtle flag that would fly outside the headquarters of the NAACP in Harlem. Each time someone was unfortunately lynched, the flag said, "A man was lynched yesterday." And that flag appeared more often than not. Marcus Garvey looked to that and said, it's fine, you're bringing awareness, but that does not actually seem to be bringing about real change. And so publicly, he spoke about the fact that if lynching was going to happen by white mobs to African Americans in the South, perhaps African American mobs should lynch whites in the North, not because he was actually articulating for the lynching, but to make the point that if one of those things is terrifying and not acceptable, then the other one isn't either. And that there needed to be some kind of system of laws, certainly nationally, that was going to prosecute this issue. But we needed to talk about it and be far more aggressive and assertive in that conversation. He will unfortunately find himself on the wrong side of the law. By 1921, Marcus Garvey was considered a public enemy of the United States. He was on the same list as gangsters. But his speech alone was not going to get him in court. So the United States government began to investigate his businesses, and ultimately he was prosecuted for fraud. Anytime you put through the public mail advertisements for things that you cannot necessarily guarantee. So there were times when he had advertisements that would offer, investment because of, his business venture growing, and he was still in the process of perhaps, making a final purchase, for example, a steamship to add to his Black Star line. And so those things were used against him, and quite easily. And in 1922, when he was convicted, he was deported because he was not a U.S. citizen. And we're going to see that tactic used by other people who are printing and speaking out against the government in this time period. But that Black nationalist movement continues on after Garvey leaves, but ultimately he was looking to lead people in a direction forward that he just didn't see being attained by other leaders. But definitely it's a movement that has controversy to it, because even in Marcus Garvey's time, he was not comfortable with African Americans and whites marrying or having children together. He was anti-Semitic. And so those things often have been criticisms of the movement in its entirety. But it was a movement itself that was looking to do something for African Americans that hadn't been happening under other leaders. So we always look at the yin and yang of history and how we get, at times, with progress with one group, we may see a reaction by the other. And we are going to see, in the same time that we're seeing this movement of African Americans north, we're also going to see a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. And those two things are both connected and not connected. So in 1915, the most popular movie of the day was something called Birth of a Nation. It had been originally a stage play and a book. The president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, a good college friend of his, wrote this. This movie premiered in the White House. Woodrow Wilson believed in the lost cause myth, certainly had views about racial superiority. As president, by executive order, segregated government jobs that had not been segregated in the past. Um, but that movie is going to take on a life of its own and in some ways fuse with other social problems of the day. So the resurgence of the Klan is for the most part not actually going to be in the South. It's well established there. It's going to be in northern and western cities. You're going to find klaverns, that's what those chapters are called, in places like Indianapolis and Omaha, Nebraska. Often people are going to be geared towards joining those organizations because they have anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish bias. Many of the movements and organizations that continue to grow between about 1950 and 1930 associated with the Klan are really more nativist in origin and sentiment, but nevertheless, it's about white supremacy. By 1925, um, you have a national day of parade and movement by the Klan, including having a parade in Washington, D.C. They were invited to pose on the steps of the Capitol building. And so, again, the Klan was not something that was secretive, but it's something quite public. These men who are marching in Washington, D.C., they don't have their faces covered. So the Klan itself as an organization and that has legitimacy in terms of limiting who can fully participate in American life, unfortunately, we will see it continuing to grow in this time period. And it's going to be really the Great Depression and ultimately what will become World War II and the Civil Rights Movement to follow that'll really begin to address and push back on this organization. When we talk about improvements in people's lives, we talk about the fact that African Americans are finding more opportunities in some areas of American life, but somehow seem to be stuck in other places with no progress forward. I think it's important that we also consider the culture of the day and how minority culture was received, particularly amongst white audiences that would not have had any direct personal experience with African Americans. Um, in terms of the media, entertainment, advertising of the 19 teens and 1920s, there was lots of racial stereotype. And the images on my screen, if they make you feel uncomfortable, good, because they should. They are incredibly stereotypical, but it's important to understand that even in something like children's fiction, the story of Little Sambo, Jim Crow himself, the idea of blackface. These were 19th century conventions in American life for entertainment. You had a character who was quick witted, but perhaps dishonest, used trickery and deceit, but they were an African American character. But because white audiences, it was in most places illegal, if not frowned upon culturally for African Americans and whites to mix, even in terms of entertainment, you had white actors in blackface. So, for young people who may not understand why blackface is an issue today, it is because it was utilized as entertainment, but a mocking of African American peoples. And so that unfortunately continues on into the 1920s. The first talkie film that was made in 1927 was called The Jazz Singer, but the actor Al Jolson wears blackface and performs and sings what was considered a traditional um, African American song. You can see the advertisement here. This gentleman, Billy Van, who his entire career was based on the fact that he played these African American characters. And even the facial features were grotesquely portrayed to make it clear of the status of that character relative to the white characters in the production. Even selling food. As food becomes more processed, products like cream of wheat, Uncle Ben's rice, Aunt Jemima pancake flour. These were not products made by African Americans, but they had African American characters that sold those products. And yes, today we have, Flo selling insurance, but these were used again as a stereotype. Well, how do I know that this is good pancake flour to use? Well, because our character is an African American woman who works in the kitchen. She was even depicted in the way that perhaps an African American woman might look in the time of slavery, as someone who worked in a house. And this is somehow going to legitimize the quality of a product. So those stereotypes are going to permeate as we have greater and greater mass media. Unfortunately, the stereotypes of the past, if not challenged, are going to continue to permeate. So at the end of World War I, as I spoke before, we've got men returning home and they expect to get their jobs back. They've served. Well, African Americans served in the war as well, about 400,000 African Americans. And they were primarily volunteers served overseas. And in 1919, we're going to have about 4 months between April and August of that year. It's often referred to as Red Summer because of the bloodshed. Um, Anytime an economy is geared towards war for a prolonged period of time and then has to reestablish itself as a peacetime economy, there is often economic upheaval. And that economic upheaval can often translate itself to social and political upheaval as well. Chicago will have the longest race riot. It'll last more than 6 weeks, but pretty much anywhere there was a city with a large African American working population, like Washington, D.C., Delaware, um, the city of Wilmington, we'll see it in Milwaukee, Detroit, you will have some kind of unrest. W.B. Du Bois, acting for the NAACP, wrote to the president in 1919 and said that there's the mob violence, particularly by whites, is a problem and it needs to stop. And it needs to understand that African American men who return from overseas, they're in uniform and being attacked and being mistreated. And that, if nothing else, as the commander in chief of the armed forces, you at the very least need to be standing up and speaking out in defense of these soldiers who are returning. Um, and it fell on deaf ears. Woodrow Wilson had no interest in any kind of racial equality. But you can see from our pictures here, and I think this one in the upper right-hand corner here, or excuse me, left-hand corner, is an important one because I think it shows you, one, the experience of African Americans who went overseas, what it must have been like to come back to a world that really hadn't changed. For African Americans who went to France in World War I in uniform as soldiers, they were treated as Americans. Where they had money, they could use it. They could eat in restaurants. They were not referenced by the color of their skin, but by the nation of their origin. And to return home and to have people who want to address you disrespectfully and not see you as equals when you have sacrificed for your country and been recognized for that sacrifice, um, what was just a problem that was not resolved in the favor of African Americans, unfortunately. We're not going to really see that until after World War II. But you can just see the level of destruction. We have this white mob here, who's getting ready to destroy this property. And ultimately, many of these riots essentially burn themselves out because literally African American neighborhoods and African Americans, the picture's blocked here, but this is a man who has been lynched by a white mob in Omaha, Nebraska in 1919. This violence will see itself coming back again throughout the 1920s. The largest and most devastating of that violence will be in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Not based on work labor shortages or too many people and not enough jobs. But in Tulsa in 1921, an African American man who worked as an elevator operator will be falsely accused of rape and is about to be lynched in the county jail where he's awaiting for his hearing. And a group of African American men who'd all served overseas had taken home with them their service weapons, came and offered him protection. And in doing so, a riot was set off. It will conclude in June of 1921 when the neighborhood that whites referred to as Little Africa, which was about 100 city blocks, it was a pretty large area, will be bombed. A group of whites will hire a plane and literally drop a bomb, ordnance from World War One, that will literally consume about 15% of the Tulsa area, and kill 100 and wound thousands. On that note, we've talked about migration and the positive things and also the negatives that come from that change, but we're also going to see another change that is going to be a change that is entirely restrictive, and that is going to be about immigration. And we're going to see that the views of the nativists of the 1840s that still permeated American life, they are going to gather more adherents in the progressive era. Um, and ultimately, it's going to be set off by what was known as the Red Scare. And if you've heard that phrase before, but you're like, wait a minute, Mrs. Cerbone, that's like the 1950s. Yes, there was a Red Scare after World War II, but the first Red Scare was after World War One. In light of what will be the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the execution of the royal family, the Tsar and his son, they abdicate, they make no more claim on the throne or to any power or money in Russia. They spend about 18 months in exile in Russia, basically under house arrest. And one night they were taken to the basement of the building where they were being kept, and they were all executed. And this picture will find itself in newspapers across the globe and will chill people wherever you had a society where there was some element that was perceived to be communist in nature and perhaps revolutionary or anarchist in nature. Um, Especially for the sort of the new royalty of America, right? The wealthiest of the wealthy, right? The monopolists may have been put under some control by now, but they are still some of the wealthiest people on the planet. If the former Tsar of Russia and his family could be brutally murdered, what might happen to them? And there were people who had been speaking about socialist and Marxist ideas. There were people who were anti US in the war. We saw that with the Schenck case and the Abrams case. The Communist Party decides to actually form and organize following World War One. There will be a multi-week strike by the Boston police force that will lead to a rise of criminality in the Boston, Massachusetts area. In 1920, someone attempted to throw a bomb at JP Morgan and they slightly wounded him, but ultimately destroyed his car here outside of his bank on Wall Street. And so there was this hysteria that there were these elements, and that if they got big enough, if they had enough people and the will, they would do what had happened in Russia, and that the United States government needs to do something about those people. In Woodrow Wilson's last year in office, which was already tumultuous because of the problems of the Versailles Conference and ultimately the treaty, he also found at home people wanted to see the executive do something about this threat of communism. And so he asked his attorney general to see to it. Do what you need to do with these people. There's already restrictions on much of what they publish and say because of the Sedition Act. You've got to take care of them. So over the course of 3 months, Mitchell Palmer put together lists of people and organizations that should be targeted. And about 6,000 people were arrested. Most of whom were arrested were never imprisoned for what they did. But those who were non US citizens, in most cases, were deported. More than 500 of them. Emma Goldman, who was a communist activist in New York in the early 20th century, will find herself being sent back to her homeland where she had come from as a child, which was Russia. Um, but these Palmer raids, even at the time, there were people who said, there are people who may be from Russia, and there may be people who actually go to meetings for the Socialist Party or the Communist Party, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to see, revolution in the United States. But nevertheless, um, it did create legitimacy. And we'll see in 1920 that there will be an armored car shooting in Massachusetts. And the two gentlemen who are accused are Italian immigrants, again, people associating with anarchists and socialist organizations. And on circumstantial evidence, they will be convicted. No fingerprints on the car. The driver and the guard who were shot, no gun found in possession of either of these men. They will attempt to go through the courts in order to secure their freedom and delegitimize what an all white Protestant jury had decided in 1920 to no avail, and will be executed in 1927. Because of this case, the American Civil Liberties Union forms, and that organization ultimately provides legal representation and tries to protect the First Amendment. And they are a controversial organization because they protect the free speech rights of lots of people who may be considered pretty fringe by the standards of the majority population in the United States. But their principle is the First Amendment is the First Amendment and should provide the greatest level of freedom and liberty for individuals. Even members of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and Louis Brandeis, both who were willing to create this clear and present danger standard in the Abrams case in 1919 and legitimize the Sedition Act, by the early 20s are saying that their interpretation of the law at that time perhaps was flawed in the fact that it's been utilized to essentially prosecute and ultimately culturally persecute individuals from immigrant backgrounds. While all this is going on, Congress has been at work about creating some kind of program that's a true restriction on immigration. Now, we had seen that in an earlier time. There's the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. In 1906, there were a series of acts that were passed to essentially stop Asiatic people from being able to gain citizenship. But by 1921, there was an Emergency Immigration Act, and it was really targeted at what were seen as potential agitators. So their concerns were about anybody coming from Russia into the United States, and they limited immigration to about 350,000 people. But just having a sheer large number was not enough. And so by 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act was passed. We're going to see it in APUSH land more often than not as the National Origins Act of 1924. The first thing it does is it bans all Asiatic immigration. So there'd already been limits against the Chinese and Koreans and Japanese going into the early 20th century, but now they have all been cut off, and that will not change until after World War II. We're also going to see European immigration going to be greatly restricted by a quota system. And if you look at the graphic here on the upper portion of the slide, you will see that when we look at what were the census data of the 19th and 20th centuries in terms of immigrants, you see a pattern that ultimately Irish, German, and English immigration is going to be pretty heavy in the first part of the 19th century. And by about 1890, it is going to be relatively at its lowest point for that century. You're also going to see that immigrants coming from Italy, Russia, Hungary, that immigration also is at its lowest in the 1880s, 1890, and is going to spike basically by 1900, 1910. So they picked 1890 as the year because it was the lowest numbers for both the old immigrants and these new immigrants. And they set a quota at 2%. So whatever was your number of immigrants in 1890 for your nation, 2% of that number could now immigrate annually to the United States. So, for instance, let's say in 1890, 100,000 Irishmen came to America. Well, now, as of 1925, it'll be 2% of that number, or 2,000 Irishmen. Um, that number is going to take what was a very large number of people at its height, more than 3 million people a year, and basically take it down to about 675,000 people. Where you're going to see some increases in immigrant groups, it's going to be in the Americas. So the National Origins Act did have an ultimate quota number, which was 675,000 people per year. But ultimately, of that number, you're going to see more people from Mexico, Canada, and other parts of the Caribbean and South America um, fill up those numbers more so than people coming from Europe. That immigration restriction, though, is going to last until 1965. So we're going to have about a 40-year period where we have far less immigration than we had had historically for the 100 years prior. And things have changed. We have a lot more automation. Yes, we've had lots of de-skilling, but the labor that was needed, and especially low-cost labor, is certainly not going to be utilized. By the mid-1930s, there's going to be a minimum wage. And where we are needing labor, it's going to be this internal migration of African Americans who are going to be taking on the work that was once done by immigrants in the North. So, as we conclude today, it may seem like we had two very different topics. We were looking at the Great Migration, this movement of African Americans northward, starting with World War I. And then we were also looking at what will be the ever increasing exclusion of immigrants from other countries. But those two things are connected by the idea of migration. The story of America is one of migration and immigration. And so those two things do go together. And often when you have an internal migration, it may impact who comes from outside, or vice versa. If you can have less people coming from outside, it may impact your already domestic population. So the first question we want to be able to answer is, how did the Great Migration create positive outcomes and challenges for African Americans? And then the second one is, how were the cultural tensions, in particular those about immigration and race, of the early 1920s, not new issues? How can we historically look back, right? This is our complexity. Where can we see issues in terms of nativism and certainly suppression of African Americans in earlier parts of our nation's history that help us understand why we're still seeing these elements in 1920? So ultimately, how are these unresolved issues from the past century?